Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, and I'm John Johnson, talking about sex is all that matters. You know what? I'm going to spin that on its ear. And you know what, ladies? If you were to accuse your man partner of saying sex is all that matters to you, you know what? He's going to dispute that. And I'll tell you why. Because he wants to be known for something other than just being interested in sex with you. He wants to be known for more than that. Guys oftentimes get accused, get labeled that that's all they want, because it's a very convenient thing to grab at, and it definitely makes guys feel defensive. Because what men want, and I've talked about this before, especially in my relationship podcast, what men want, they want respect. And if they come off as being blamed or being accused that sex is all you want, then it makes them one-dimensional. And guys are not simply one-dimensional. And some women will even say guys are simple. I think that's low-hanging fruit. We can debate that on the strength that some people want to compare men and women as far as the sophistication or the level of complexity. And a lot can be said about either. But keeping it strictly along the lines of men, and I'm a guy myself, and I understand some of our interests, and a lot of things that guys get labeled for because it's easy, and they don't necessarily do a lot of pushback unless you get into a real serious debate. And it would seem sometimes that to get overly worked up about this stuff might be a bit petty. It's things that have been talked about for years and years and years and years, and you're not going to necessarily change that by getting worked up in one conversation. So, I mean, that's why guys a lot of times don't push back on it. But given the fact that men are not just one-dimensional, I'm just going to say it that way, because they do have feelings. We, men, I'm going to include myself in this part, we do have feelings. We do like to be taken seriously. And if someone were to say to me as a guy that all you're interested in is sex, I can say unequivocally that there are moments when that feels like the most important thing in this moment. But I think overall, my level of engagement in other parts of my life really dictate that I know how to put sex and the interest of in a particular place. And when with my partner being interested in being loving or being in lovemaking, that's something that I know when to and when not to. I think that stands for most guys, given that we have responsibilities, and some guys are easily distracted, and that works the direction they can be distracted to sex or distracted away from it. You choose which one applies. But basically what I'm attempting to do here is give guys a little more leverage here in the understanding for themselves, and also to women to recognize that guys have more going on than just getting you to bed. There are times when it seems like that's the only focus, and that has its place, but it's not 24/7. And why we perceive it to be based on the experiences that some people have, yeah, studies have been shown to explain how often men think about sex compared to women. Those are comparisons that get brought up as if that explains men in general. And again, going back to, if you were to accuse a guy of just wanting sex, he's going to push back knowing that he has other interests. Mainly, and I'm going to repeat this many times, men really like to be respected. They like to be respected for who they are, what they know, what they bring to the table, meaning that they want to be appreciated for their contribution to the relationship as well. See, guys hear negative things about themselves as men, and without even thinking about it, sometimes they buy into it and then repeat it, not only for themselves, but for other people. It happens. They make jokes about it. And I think that's one way to sort of diffuse the frustration around it. We make jokes about it. But when having a real serious discussion about the topic, sometimes they just get stuck. Because if the conversation happens to be with a woman who is very steeped in her opinion, then the guy feels like, okay, well, I'm going to lose this contest/conversation because one of the things that I don't want to do is upset my partner. So therein lies one of the things that men will do. They will, and I don't want to say this is backing down. It has to do with thinking, all right, I don't want to die on that hill, because pushing this issue is not going to necessarily get me what I want, which is to be respected. So it would appear that the thing to do in this case would be to be a listener and to just understand where the other person is coming from. That is something that men do quite often. Now, they don't necessarily announce that because it would seem a little too self-serving to say something like that, because it'll come off as being condescending to their partner. So guys, don't say that. Sometimes they don't have the presence of mind to put it in those terms, but that's what's operating. A very good friend of mine was having this very discussion with his girlfriend, and the contest, and this is where this really became difficult, because in order for him to prove his point, the point that she raised was, okay, well, if sex isn't all that matters to you, then let's do without it. Well, that's not what kind of outcome he wanted. Abstinence or not being able to be intimate with his partner. Yeah, that was an extreme. She was able to pull that card out because she knew that he didn't want to have to live with that. So rather than debate that, because that was one of the choices on the table, he just decided to not die on that hill and left it alone. So she obviously was able to pull a lot of leverage out with that particular point to argue. And I would say most guys don't really get into an argument about the subject because their feeling is they are going to lose. But I can tell you that sex isn't all that matters. But you really have to get into these philosophical conversations, and I'll tell this, not around the time that you're having a sexual encounter. Because what tends to happen during those times is, since this is something that can cause conflict, you don't want to have conflict around that particular activity in the relationship, because it usually doesn't bode very well. If you can gather where I'm going with this, it's as if you're discussing a problem. And one of the things that you don't do when you're having sex is bring up the topic of the relationship problems, because it is a killer in terms of intimacy and romance in that regard. You bring it up at a different time so that you can have it worked out, so that when the romance or the intimacy is coming up, then you don't have the roadblocks there. But if you haven't discussed this stuff ahead of time and it comes up at those moments, what I'm saying is this is when it starts getting ingrained that this is not something that's going to be pleasurable. And most people will not want to engage. So guys, you don't get in an argument with your partner around sex when you're having sex. Ladies, same thing. Don't get into an argument about sex when you're about to have sex. It just makes it seem like it's going to be a very unpleasant experience. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back after this.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about sex isn't all that matters. I led off with that segment. Okay, I've got to help somebody do some damage control now. So I'm going to explain to you the scenario. And I mean, this kind of stuff happens. And it happens by mistake. It's just people having conversations and they forget that, yeah, honesty is the best policy, but sometimes you don't talk about everything you know. And sex is one of those things that when we're talking about prior relationships, you really have to be careful that you're not talking up the old relationship when you're with your present person. That is, when talking about the ex, too many people aren't really worried about the fact when the old sex isn't as good as what you're having now. But when there's starts to be a comparison and what you had before with somebody else is better than what you have now, that comes as such a slap in the face. But these kinds of conversations happen all the time. And I think we slip into them inadvertently because we tend to forget what time zone we're in. We are in the present time. We are not in the past. And you know how people get into reminiscing about things. And if you've had a busy love life, you might even talk a little too much about your old partners. And if you're talking with your friends, then maybe you can just talk away. But when you have your significant other in the room, you really, like I said, you need to know who your audience is. And it should go without saying, but you don't bring up your past relationships in these scenarios. Especially, like I said, in this case, people are talking about their old lovers and how good it was and this, that, and the other. I mean, I could even go so far as to say, when you're talking about your present lover, and if there has been, let's say you've had the relationship a while, if there's been some sexual issues, then and you're working on them, you can talk about your past, meaning your past together, and use that as a reference point. Talk about things that may have worked well or and something you might like to try a little bit more, and you have to be very careful about how you word things. Because this is such a touchy subject, then, people can easily get their feelings hurt, and, we're trying to steer around that part of it. We're trying to be open and honest, but we still want, what we want to have a good, intimate relationship experience. But inadvertently hurting people's feelings can happen because, like I said, this is a very touchy subject. And going back to my example, even if you're talking about your present partner and a love life that you may have had, you say it may have been a little more robust at one time, but right now things are not working the same. Again, be careful how you word this because we are talking about feelings, and we're working towards something here. We're working towards improvement. And the way you do that is you really have to show in the conversation that you are being considerate, that feelings do matter. Because remember how I was initially talking, especially in that first segment, about sex isn't all that matters. Men like to feel like they're being respected. And feelings, respecting their feelings about it. I mean, no guy wants to feel like he is not as good as his old self. And I'm not talking about just propping them up, mentally and making them think that they're great when they've certainly had some decline. But I think we all recognize that they're at some point in time we're kind of on the backside of the hill and we're going down. But we can talk about those kinds of things, especially when you're a couple. You can reference those things in a different way, in a tender way, and not as an assault on someone's virility, because as that is important to a man, and wanting to please his partner as much as he possibly can. I know women may believe that it's all about a man and feeding his ego. Those things have been said, and certainly a lot can be made about that. But men really do care about pleasing their partner. Some are not very skilled at it, but they do care. It is incumbent upon men to be interested in learning what they need to learn so that they can be a skilled lover. But that having been said, back to the part of when discussing love relationships, it is not a really good comparison to talk about your old ex-lovers when you have your lover in front of you as a comparison, especially when we're talking about the ex having been a better one than what you have presently. Because that whole discussion about intimacy, it certainly gets your attention. I mean, we all like to feel like we're doing the right thing, or when we have the conversation, we don't want to feel like we're a failure. And those comparisons sometimes are apples to oranges, because when you think about someone's past, let's say your own, and you're talking about your old lover, you were a different person too. Therefore, as things change, people change with us. And that's also something to... So back to the damage control. Number one, once it's already happened, once the comment is made and the feelings are hurt, there certainly needs to be a recognition that it may have been a slip of the tongue. It was inadvertent. Alcohol was involved. My medications were off. Something to acknowledge the insensitivity of the comment, and trying to take it back is probably going to take not only an acknowledgement of the slip of the tongue, but it's probably going to take time to get over the hurt, especially if you kind of went on and on and on. And remember what I said about doing these things in the appropriate setting, doing or having this kind of conversation in a group setting where it may humiliate your significant other can definitely be one of these where the damage control is going to take quite a bit of time. So this is a beforehand snapshot of, okay, don't do this. But let's say you've made that mistake, that comment has come out. Hopefully you recognize it sooner rather than later so that you can give an apology. And, the thing about something like this, and this is where being aware of who you are around when you are speaking, because you know how when you say something and it's incorrect, the audience that receives that message, if you know who everyone is in the audience, then you can correct it. You can be sure and make the fix. But if you don't know who is there to correct it, to undo the damage, then sometimes it's just something that gets out there and it becomes gossip, and it can be very embarrassing for your partner. I'm going to take a break, and I'm going to come right back to this point, and I'll show you how to fix this in the damage control.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello there. Welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, talking about sexes and all that matters. And we are now into that segment where I've been talking about damage control. So why are we doing damage control? Because we said something about our significant other, about our partner, our lover, whichever word applies in your relationship, and it hurt their feelings to the tune that, was it a slip of the tongue? Whatever happened here, we want to fix it because it is also going to ruin your relationship. It's going to be meaning your position with them. And you don't just necessarily want to, because you can't just put this all on them. People react the way they react, but sometimes you say dumb things. And if you do that, you're going to have to fix it. So the damage control part really has to do with taking ownership of whatever it was you said. Don't go blaming the other person because you said it. Because you have control over what comes out of your mouth or what you imply. And quite often, that's something that we get caught up in. It's the implication of what we say. And then when somebody takes it, and I'm going to use air quotes, wrong, then we want to blame them for taking it wrong. No, that's something you got to be really careful about too, because that's a slippery slope. Some things shouldn't be said, but given that many things can be interpreted in a way that is negative. And, granted, when we're talking about some of these things, it's very easy to slip and go negative. You can say, well, they were insecure when they heard it, so it's really their fault for taking it that way. When you're trying to do damage control, that's not a good tactic. The best thing to do is to take ownership of it, apologize for what you said, and that it hurt their feelings. And that's a good start. Remember, don't blame the other person, because the only thing that does is it just seems to add fuel to the fire. It makes it seem like you're trying to cover up the fact that you made a mistake. Or even if maybe it wasn't a mistake, it just becomes almost a circular conversation, and you can't get out of that by blaming. That doesn't work. Damage control is not about blaming. It's about taking responsibility. And when you do that, you'll find that the pathway out of this mess is a lot shorter. Some people make the mistake of digging their heels in the part of saying, well, you misunderstood what I meant. Well, what you meant might be a lot different in terms of how it's interpreted compared to what you said. And everybody takes whatever they hear and interprets it through their own filter. And that could be any of several different ways at any given time. And that's another reason why when you're talking about various things, you want to check in with your listener to see where they're at. And again, this damage control thing, it's a concept, and some people don't do it very well. like I said, a lot of people start out by blaming the listener for misunderstanding, where the speaker is making a point and maybe not very articulate at making the point. They slip and they say things. Well, you need to understand what your words mean and understand your listener, your audience. Therefore, knowing those, then you're more likely to be able to make the point. And the audience part, checking in. And his audience, even if it's an audience of one, check in with them. That's a very, very important thing to be able to do so that you are being heard, so that you're being understood the way you intend. And a skillful speaker, in this case, if you're having a conversation with someone, you can learn on the fly what to say and, importantly, what not to say. Because if your listener is going a direction with the way they're understanding things, don't just plow through and say whatever's on the top of your head that may, in fact, be something that you're now going to have to do damage control. Be very careful. I would say put a stop on your speaking part. Get your listener shored up so that you're going the right direction. And in some cases, it's probably a good time to take a break, maybe stop that conversation, go off to something else, because you know how when you're talking about some of these things, you can beat it into the ground. And if you're a person who has lots of discussions, then you can obviously pick up the discussion at another time. If you have very few discussions, then you may have to schedule something, but really, the damage control part, I can't overemphasize how that starts. The best thing for you to do is to take responsibility for the things that you say. And we call it damage control in particular when somebody's feelings get hurt. Because if that isn't happening, then you really don't have to worry about taking something back, right? So I've defined it for you. I've given you specific direction about how to do it, and checking in with your listener. Make sure they understand that the last thing you want to do is hurt their feelings. So by at least expressing that, making that just as verbal as whatever it was that you said, then somebody who loves you is going to try to give you the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's an important quality that a relationship has, is that your partner wants to give you the benefit of the doubt. That being the case, you can probably get over this thing a lot faster by taking responsibility. So, remember, damage control, it's about taking responsibility and giving an apology and moving past it. Because the one thing you don't want to do is once you have given the apology, you don't want to harp on it. Remember, you don't spin this around and tell them how poorly they misunderstood you or blame them for that. Maybe they did. But allow them to offer that. Or if you do say it, I believe you misunderstood what I was trying to say. Say it in a nice way. Because if you command it of them, then they're liable to push back. Meaning, no, I understood what you said. Because some people say things with a little bit of sarcasm, and that's not necessarily a good tactic. So leave the sarcasm out of it, because sarcasm in these situations tends to be what I call passive aggressive. So that's just a way of sort of doing a backhanded way of getting whatever it was, your gripe out there, but then not have it be that they can get back at you. So once again, damage control 101, accept responsibility, make the apology, and move on. And learning from this experience is you don't make your present partner the comparison, or at least the less of the two, when you're making comparisons about previous lovers. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, talking to you. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.